A Boeing 777 carrying over 300 people begins sinking towards the water on its final approach to San Francisco. The passengers are oblivious to the danger they're in, but the pilots are confused about why their aircraft isn't responding. Horrified onlookers watch as the massive plane desperately tries to climb. The captain slams the throttle levers fully forwards, but has he done this soon enough to save the plane? This is the story of Asiana Airlines Flight 214. On a warm Saturday afternoon in the summer of 2013, 291 passengers filed onto a Boeing 777 operated by Asiana Airlines. They were bound for San Francisco, on the west coast of the United States, a 10-hour journey across the Pacific Ocean. Almost half of the passengers were Chinese citizens, stopping over at Seoul on the way from Shanghai. This included a group of 70 students and teachers who were traveling to the US for a summer camp. There were also 77 Koreans on board, 61 US citizens, and people of several other nationalities. Taking care of them in the cabin were 12 flight attendants. By all indications, this was set to be a completely run-of-the-mill flight. Asiana Airlines had a good safety record, and the aircraft being used, the 777-200, was one of the most reliable and technologically advanced aircraft in the sky, never having had a single passenger fatality since its introduction 18 years previously. The flight, designated as Flight 214, was scheduled to depart Seoul at 5 p.m. local time. It would fly into the night, and then into the dawn the next day, touching down in San Francisco just before noon local time. For this reason, there were not 2 pilots on board, but 4. In command of the flight was 49-year-old Captain Lee Jong-min. Lee was an experienced pilot, with over 12,000 hours flying time under his belt, over 3,000 of which were on the 777. He was described by colleagues as calm, and as someone who followed the procedures correctly, had professional knowledge of the flight, and had good capability and skill as an instructor. That skill as an instructor would be important today, because on this flight, Captain Lee would be sitting in the right-hand seat, supervising the pilot to his left, 45-year-old Captain Lee Kang-kook. Kang-kook was transitioning over to the 777 from the Airbus A320, which he had flown for the last 6 years. He was just halfway through his training in order to be signed off as a captain on the 777. As such, he was new to the aircraft, with just 43 hours flying time. Despite how new he was to the plane, however, he was still an experienced pilot, having built up almost 10,000 hours total time. Also on board, sitting in the business class section at the front of the cabin, were a relief captain and a relief first officer. 52-year-old relief captain Lee Jong-ju and 40-year-old relief first officer Bong Dong-won would be taking over from the pilots during the cruise to allow them to rest before they carried out the landing in San Francisco. Because the pilots were based in Korea, it would be 3 o'clock in the morning body clock time when they performed the approach and landing. This is the point during the day at which human performance is at its worst. This made it all the more important that the pilots were well rested on landing. With all of the passengers finally on board, the baggage loaded and the fuel uplifted, the cabin crew closed the doors and the massive aircraft was pushed back from the gate at Seoul. The pilots started the engines and began their taxi out to the runway. Before that, I want to say a quick word about today's sponsor, Opera. Opera's new web browser is the cleanest, quickest way to use the web today. One of my favourite features is the Tab Islands feature. I find this really useful because rather than racking up a jumbled mess of disparate tabs as I browse, I can organise my tabs into islands grouped by common themes. So here I've got a tab island for some stuff I'm learning as part of my flight training. Here I've got a tab island for explainer videos of certain concepts, and here I've got a tab island for my work on Green Dot Aviation. I can expand and contract these tab islands as I want, which makes it so much easier to stay organised and productive. You might have noticed that those tab islands are pretty work related though, and that's because I have them all in this particular workspace. My plan is that when I've finished working today, I'll just switch over to this workspace here on the left. This opens up an entirely new window within the browser, so it's a lot easier for me to separate work from play. Opera also has its own browser AI, Aria. This is handy because whenever I have a question which Google can't answer, I just ask Aria. It gives detailed and helpful responses that actually make sense, and it's especially useful because it's integrated within the browser itself. It's also great to know that with the built-in ad blocker and VPN, I can keep my data safe online with a single click. Opera really feels like the future of the web. Everything I need is just there in the browser itself. Click my link in the video description to download Opera. It's free, it's fast, and it just works. Now, back to the video. Before long, Flight 214 had reached the runway and was cleared for takeoff. The captain under supervision pushed the thrust levers to their takeoff setting, and moments later he lifted the plane into the air. The aircraft performed perfectly on takeoff, and it began climbing serenely out over the yellow sea. The captain monitored the aircraft's performance and the performance of his trainee captain as they turned northeast towards San Francisco. The first part of the flight was uneventful. As the aircraft flew east into the night, the 291 passengers were served their meals, and many of them tried to get some sleep. 4 hours and 15 minutes after takeoff, it was the pilot's turn to get some rest. The relief pilots took the controls up in the cockpit, while the main crew headed back towards the business class cabin. They were scheduled to get 5 hours of rest, and would return to the cockpit shortly before the descent into San Francisco. Despite being liable to be disturbed by noisy passengers, crying babies, and PA announcements, Asiana Airlines, as well as national regulators, considered and still consider it acceptable for airlines to allow long-haul flights to operate without rest facilities which are situated away from the passenger cabin, like bunks. In many ways, the pilots of Flight 214 were lucky to even be allowed out of the cockpit for rest. Some airlines still insist any rest must be taken in the cockpit to avoid disturbing passengers. So, the two pilots tried their best to get some rest as they reclined in their seats at about 9 p.m. body clock time. Flight 214 continued out over the Pacific Ocean, its progress monitored by the two relief pilots. 4.5 hours later, at around 1:30 in the morning Korea time, trainee captain Lee Kang-kook returned to the brightly lit cockpit. He had finished his rest period half an hour early, because this was a training flight and he wanted to be prepared. He was looking forward to the approach into San Fran. He hadn't been to the city for 10 years. But at the same time, he was anxious. Construction work was underway at the end of runway 28 left, where he would be landing. This meant that the runway's glide slope wasn't working. The glide slope is the vertical component of the instrument landing system, which gives pilots electronic guidance down to the runway. Without the glide slope, Kang-kook would have to judge his descent towards the runway visually, something he wasn't all that used to doing. A visual approach shouldn't have been a big deal though. The weather at San Francisco was perfect for flying, and the pilots would be able to see the runway from miles out. But the trainee captain's nerves weren't entirely unjustified. His inexperience with manual flying and visual approaches was a result of Asiana Airlines' policy that pilots should use automation as much as possible. In fact, the airline actively discouraged manual flying. A contract simulator instructor at the airline would go on to say that he believed that pilots avoided flying manually because they thought they might do something wrong. And it wouldn't be all that surprising if these fears were warranted, because the Asiana Airlines training syllabus didn't even include training on the approximate pitch and power settings needed to achieve a standard 3-degree glide path down to the runway. In other words, pilots at Asiana had become so accustomed to using automation and doing the same things over and over again that when something unusual happened, like in this case an inoperative glide slope, they weren't confident in their abilities to simply fly the aircraft manually using visual references. In fact, this would be Kang-kook's first ever approach in the 777 without the aid of a glide slope. It wasn't that he was worried about doing something dangerous though. His concern was that if he didn't carry out the visual approach correctly, he could quite easily fail his line check. This weighed heavily on his mind as he briefed the captain on the approach and began the descent towards San Francisco. But there is more to the story of Flight 214 than a simple lack of familiarity with how to carry out a visual approach. The 777 is different to the Airbus A320 which Kang-kook was used to flying in many respects. One key difference between the aircraft is how their auto-throttle system works. In a few moments, we'll see how this subtle difference played a crucial role in the events which are now about to unfold. It was now 11:15 in the morning local time at San Francisco, or 2:45 a.m. body clock time for the pilots. As they got closer to the airport, their workload began to increase. Shortly after the pilots had completed their descent checklist and approach briefing, the relief first officer re-entered the cockpit and strapped into the center jump seat behind the pilots. He would act as an extra set of eyes to monitor the approach, as the training captain was going to be fully occupied in his training role. Meanwhile, the relief captain relaxed in the cabin, where he would stay for the rest of the flight. Initially, as Flight 214 descended towards the airport, everything was routine. The pilots even took a moment to appreciate the iconic cityscape, with the captain commenting on the San Francisco Bay Bridge. Shortly after, while descending through 6,300 feet, the pilots told air traffic control that they were now visual with the airport. As expected, the controller cleared the flight for a visual approach to runway 28 left. Things would now start to happen quite quickly. Even though the glide slope wasn't working, the localizer was still in service. The localizer tells pilots their position relative to the center line of the runway, as in whether they are left or right of it. The crew's plan was to follow the localizer for lateral guidance and to use their own judgment for vertical guidance. Within a few moments, the aircraft's computers had detected the localizer's signal, and the autopilot began aligning the plane with the runway centerline. At this point, all that trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook had to do was to maintain a steady rate of descent while reducing speed from 215 knots to the target approach speed of 137 knots. The question now was where he should commence his descent. Even when flying the most advanced aircraft, pilots still use basic maths to ensure that the aircraft starts descending at the right place and that it descends at the right rate. For example, in a similarly sized aircraft like the Airbus A330, the magic number is 4. No matter what altitude you are at, if you multiply your altitude by 4, you'll get the number of miles needed for the aircraft to descend and land. For example, if an aircraft is at 10,000 feet, the distance needed would be 40 miles. That's how many miles out you need to be when you start descending, but what about your rate of descent? In order to maintain a standard 3-degree descent profile, pilots divide the ground speed of the aircraft by 2 and add a 0. So if the ground speed of the aircraft was 150 knots, the rate of descent needed to maintain a 3-degree glide path would be 150 divided by 2, which is 75, and add a 0, which is 750. So a descent rate of 750 feet per minute. Pilots can monitor the rate of descent using this instrument here, and adjust as needed. But owing to Asiana's emphasis on automation, Kang-kook was not in the habit of doing these calculations. He was used to a situation where the glide slope was active, enabling him to simply follow the flight directors, these purple bars here, all the way down to the runway. It was simply no longer second nature for him to control the descent profile using this sort of mental maths. As the aircraft slowed down, the autothrottle reduced power to the engines. And it is here that we need to get a bit technical about the automation modes in the Boeing 777, because what is about to go wrong on this flight is a direct result of the pilot's lack of familiarity with the intricacies of the aircraft's autothrottle system. The autopilot and autothrottle have 3 modes of operation. The first of these is vertical speed mode. Vertical speed refers to how fast the aircraft is climbing or descending, and is measured in feet per minute. A typical vertical speed for the final approach would be about 800 feet per minute. As in, if you're at an altitude of 3,000 feet at one point in time, 1 minute later, you'll be at 2,200 feet. When in vertical speed mode, the autopilot will pitch the aircraft up or down to achieve the vertical speed set by the pilots in this window here. In this mode, the plane's forward speed, that is, its airspeed, is controlled by engine thrust. The second mode of the autothrust is flight level change, or flight level change speed. In this mode, things are the other way around. The plane controls the airspeed not by using the throttles, but by pitching up or down. So naturally, when it needs to go faster, it pitches down, and when it needs to go slower, it pitches up. In this case, the rate at which it climbs or descends, its vertical speed, is controlled by the engine thrust. The final autothrust mode, and the one which is most crucial for understanding what's about to happen here, is hold. In this mode, the autothrottle motor is disconnected from the thrust levers, and therefore the autothrottle no longer controls the airspeed or the vertical speed of the aircraft. The autothrottle can enter hold mode if the pilot moves the thrust levers manually, or if the vertical speed mode is flight level change speed when the thrust levers reach the flight idle position. If all of that seemed like a lot of information to take in, you're not alone. Pilots spend quite a bit of time coming to terms with these modes and their applications during their training. Trainee Captain Kang-kook himself had covered these modes in ground school back in Korea, and they were very different from the modes he had become accustomed to in his Airbus A320. Now, he would have to apply his knowledge of them in the real world, while flying an unfamiliar visual approach into a busy airport he had never flown into, at 3 a.m. body clock time, all while being supervised by somebody who could easily decide that his recent career move wasn't for him. The plane was now 14 nautical miles from the runway threshold. At this point, it was slightly above the altitude it should have been at for a 3-degree glide path. The training captain suggested that they descend slowly to 1,800 feet, and Kang-kook selected 1,800 feet in the autopilot panel. 1,800 was the minimum altitude at the Duyet waypoint, 5.4 miles from the runway threshold. As the pilots were already visual with the runway, there was no need to be at that altitude at the waypoint. However, it did serve as a good reference point to ensure that the plane was on the standard glide path. Air traffic control asked the pilots to keep their speed at a relatively fast 180 knots until they were 5 nautical miles from the runway. The pilots accepted this request, but this now put them under more pressure to get the plane down in time. Kang-kook selected a speed of 180 knots on the autopilot panel, and asked for the captain to lower the flaps to 5 degrees. But the plane was still too fast to safely extend the flaps to 5 degrees, so the captain had to wait a while before lowering them. This was the first small error which showed that the pilots were beginning to lose touch with their aircraft. The plane was still travelling faster than its selected speed of 180 knots, so in order to slow down, the autopilot raised the plane's nose. This was expected, given that the autothrottle was in flight level change speed mode, which we discussed a moment ago. But there was a problem. The aircraft was already higher than it was supposed to be, and this pitch up brought it even further above the ideal glide path. The descent rate, which initially was 900 feet per minute, now shallowed to a mere 300 feet per minute. A small deviation from the ideal path isn't a big deal though. The pilots had a few tools at their disposal to bring them back onto the right path. In this case, they could have helped the plane down by lowering the landing gear early. Or, even better, they could have deployed the speed brakes on the wings, which would not only slow the plane down, but would help it descend faster too. But for some reason, the pilots did neither of these things. Instead, Cook changed the autopilot mode to vertical speed, and dialed in a rate of 1,000 feet per minute. This worked in the sense that the aircraft's nose immediately dropped to achieve the rate of descent, but it had the side effect of making the airspeed faster than desired. Again, as a consequence of this, the autothrottle went into speed mode, meaning that the throttles were now controlling the speed. The only problem here was that the throttles were already at idle. The pilots couldn't have it both ways. They couldn't both descend faster while slowing down. At least, not without lowering the gear or deploying the speed brakes, which they didn't think to do. As a result, their aircraft stayed about 5 knots above the speed that the air traffic controller had requested. This discrepancy between the requested speed by air traffic control and the actual speed of the aircraft was completely missed by both the captain under training and the training captain himself. It was the relief first officer who called the issue to the attention of the crew, saying that they were too fast. Cook was now becoming overloaded. His spare capacity had reduced to such a level that even the basic principles of slowing an aircraft down now seemed to elude him. Several times, he was reminded that he needed to reduce his speed to 180 knots by 5 miles, before he finally acknowledged that requirement. Shortly after this, he asked for the gear to be lowered. Just a few moments later, the training captain finally stated the obvious, that the aircraft was high. By this point, it appeared that even the training captain was becoming a little stressed. This wasn't too surprising, given that this was the first time he had ever operated as a training captain on the 777. This was a test of his own abilities, as well as those of the captain he was supervising. Cook said that he would descend more steeply, and he dialed in a vertical speed of 1,500 feet per minute. This is quite a lot for a final approach, and it really amounted to a last-ditch effort to get the plane on the correct vertical profile. However, it appeared to be working. With this increased vertical speed, not only did the 777 slowly begin to close in on the 3-degree glide path, but the extra drag of the now extended undercarriage finally brought the speed under control. Although things finally appeared to be going in the right direction, the plane was still above the ideal glide path. Then, the training captain announced 1,000, and Cook reduced the plane's descent rate to 1,000 feet per minute. Once again, the plane began to drift above the ideal glide path. 1,000 feet per minute was not enough to bring it down onto the glide path in time. This was not the smooth, orderly approach that the pilots had been expecting, nor did it resemble the slow, methodical way in which they'd been trained. As the aircraft descended through 3,000 feet, the approach controller handed Flight 214 over to San Francisco Tower. During the approach briefing, the pilots had discussed that in the event of a go-around, they would need to climb to the missed approach altitude of 3,000 feet. So, as they passed 3,000 feet, Cook again reached over to the autopilot panel and increased the previously selected 1,800 feet to 3,000. In an effort to lose speed, Cook asked for flap 20. He then immediately selected an airspeed of 152 knots and called for flaps 30. This was the second time he had called for a flap setting that was too much for the plane's speed. He was at 174 knots now, and would need to be at 170 before the flaps could be extended to 30 degrees. The training captain called, "Speed check flaps 30, sir," pointing out that they were still above the speed limit of 170 knots. The crew were both high and fast, the last place you would want to be on any approach. With each passing second, the trainee captain's options to salvage the approach were becoming increasingly limited. The first and most sensible option would be to admit defeat and commence a go-around. If he did this, he would easily be able to make a second approach at a lower and more controlled speed. If he didn't want to do that though, he still had the option of descending faster and extending the speed brakes. But he did neither of these things. Instead, he made the bizarre decision to select flight level change speed. As we've already mentioned, the effect of selecting flight level change speed is that the aircraft pitches up or down to attain the airspeed selected on the autopilot, and the auto throttle switches to thrust mode to attain the commanded altitude, which, in this case, was 3,000 feet. In other words, by selecting flight level change speed, Cook had now put the aircraft in a climb up to 3,000 feet. His lack of familiarity with the aircraft's automation modes, combined with fatigue and his lack of practice at this kind of approach, had conspired to make him do something nonsensical. But pilots are human, and mistakes of this kind are not altogether uncommon. In fact, it's exactly the reason that there were 3 pilots in the cockpit at this point, rather than 2. But when approaches go this bad this close to the ground, the best option is to go around. But that's not what the pilots of Flight 214 did. Instead, the captain simply stated, "Sir." This was followed neither by an explanation nor by advice. Eventually, Cook realized the predicament he had placed himself in. Somehow, he had put his plane in a climb to 3,000 feet. To stop the 777 from pitching up any further, he disconnected the autopilot. To prevent the engines from providing climb power, he manually brought the thrust levers back to idle. This changed the auto thrust mode to hold. As previously mentioned, this resulted in the auto throttle motor becoming disconnected from the throttle levers. The engine thrust was now, literally speaking, in the trainee captain's hands. The autopilot now had nothing to do with the aircraft's speed. But airlines have standard operating procedures in place so that this exact confusion doesn't happen on the flight deck. As a rule, all changes to any auto thrust or autopilot mode must be called out by the flying pilot to keep the monitoring pilot in the loop. The mode changes appear here on both pilots' primary flight displays, and pilots become accustomed to calling them out almost reflexively. In this case, no callouts were made by either pilot. As a result of this, both pilots still believed that the auto throttle was in speed mode, with the auto throttles controlling the plane's speed. Cook now reached up to the autopilot panel to set the target speed of 137 knots. However, at this moment, selecting any speed in the autopilot was pointless. With the thrust lever back at idle and the auto throttle motors disengaged, the aircraft's speed would be entirely dependent on its pitch, not on the engines. Again, the pilots would have known this if they had been monitoring the mode changes on their primary flight displays, but they were now too preoccupied to do this. With just 3 miles to go, the aircraft was still too high and it wasn't descending fast enough to make it back to the glide path. But with the engines on idle, the speed was at least now reducing. Things were looking good on that front, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. Despite all of the confusion over the autopilot modes, one thing was crystal clear. Out their windscreens, the pilots could clearly see 4 white lights beside the runway. These lights are known as PAPI lights, which stands for Precision Approach Path Indicators. These give pilots an indication of their position relative to the ideal glide path. If the plane is on the glide path, there should be 2 red lights and 2 white lights. If the pilots are slightly low, there will be 3 reds and 1 white. And if they're very low, there'll be 4 reds. In this case, the pilots had 4 white lights, meaning that they were well above where they needed to be. In the passenger cabin, nobody could tell that anything was amiss. The approach looked completely normal as the plane coasted over the bay. Cook called for the flight directors to be turned off. This was standard operating procedure at Asiana for all visual approaches, as the flight directors, these purple bars here which guide the pilots, offer no relevant information at this point. But now, the training captain made what was to be a small but ultimately fatal mistake. The normal practice is for both flight directors to be turned off, and then for the pilot monitoring, which was him, to turn their own flight director back on. The point of this is to reset the auto thrust from its current mode of hold and put it back into speed mode. If this had happened, the auto thrust would have demanded the correct thrust setting to achieve the airspeed dialed into the autopilot. But for some reason, the training captain never reset his flight director. He simply turned off Cook's flight director. As a result, the aircraft systems did not register any change in the auto throttle mode, so the thrust levers stayed back at idle. Just before the plane descended through 1,000 feet, the training captain commented, "It's high." Cook responded by pushing the control column forward, but he went too far when he did this. The vertical speed now reached an excess of 1,800 feet per minute, nearly twice the 1,000 feet rate permitted by Asiana standard operating procedures. This breach was immediately highlighted by the relief first officer. Nothing changed. Again, the first officer called sink rate. With its excessively fast rate of descent, the plane began to approach the 3-degree glide path as it neared 500 feet. Despite all of their mistakes on this approach, the crew now had one last procedure, which, if followed, would save the day. At 500 feet on jet aircraft, there is a stable call. The pilot monitoring will call 500 feet, and the pilot flying has one of two responses, either stable or go round. There are 4 requirements for a stable approach. The plane must be at the right speed, on the glide path, it must have the landing gear down and the correct flap set, and it must have the correct descent rate. Flight 214 met all but the last of these criteria. It was still descending at 1,000 feet per minute, rather than the correct rate of about 700 feet per minute. What's more, the thrust was still back at idle, when, given the amount of drag the flaps and gear were providing, it would be expected to be at about 50% power. The issue here is that in case of a go-round, it takes around 7 to 10 seconds for a jet engine to spool up from idle to full power. But in this afternoon, none of these considerations were made by the pilots. There was no 500 call from the training captain, and so there was no stable or go-round call from Cook. Ultimately, it was the responsibility of the training captain to monitor the approach, and even though he wasn't the one flying the plane, it was his responsibility to insist on a go-round at 500 feet. Instead, Flight 214 carried on with the thrust back at idle as it passed through 500 feet. Now, as they intercepted the ideal descent path at last, Cook increased the pitch of the aircraft. Finally, at this late stage, it looked like they would make the landing. But with the engines on idle thrust, the airspeed continued to decrease. For the first time, the plane began to sink below the glide path. Cook noticed that the PAPI lights were showing 3 reds and 1 white. Rather than moving the throttles, which he thought were in speed mode, he increased the pitch even further to try and regain the correct glide angle. This would have worked on his Airbus A320, as the auto thrust would have compensated for the increase in pitch by powering up the engines. But in the 777, with the engines on idle, pitching up only made the problem worse. The airspeed now bled off even more. Cook was now thoroughly confused. Why was the power not increasing? The aircraft was now significantly below the correct approach speed. Its nose was high, and despite this, it was still descending at 900 feet per minute. The PAPI lights showed 4 reds. If there was ever a time to go around, it was now. But the only response from the crew came in the form of Cook raising the nose even further to get back up to the glide path. It was a futile effort. The airspeed was now so low that there was not enough airflow over the wings to provide lift for a climb. The training captain looked at his speed tape. The airspeed had dropped to 120 knots when it should have held at 137. He was dumbfounded. Had something malfunctioned? "It's low," he called, without specifying what was low. Neither pilot touched the thrust levers. The plane's automated voice announced,
100.
meaning that they were now 100 feet above the water. Finally realizing the dire situation the aircraft was in, the captain slammed the thrust levers as far forward as he could. The engine spooled up painfully slowly, the aircraft continued to descend, and the speed dropped to an unrecoverable 103 knots as the automated voice announced.
50.
The voice continued
40,
its countdown to disaster.
20.
In desperation, Cook called go round. He was 500 feet too late. At a speed of 106 knots, the undercarriage slammed into the seawall short of the runway threshold. The tail then followed and was ripped from the aircraft, causing the rest of the fuselage to impact the tarmac of runway 28 left. The aircraft then cartwheeled around its left wingtip and slammed onto its belly, thumping to a stop off the side of the runway. Then, silence. Immediately, the senior cabin crew member made her way to the flight deck to ask if the crew should evacuate the aircraft. Amazingly, she was told to stand by. The pilots deemed it more important to ask air traffic control about the condition of the aircraft than to order an evacuation. However, a flight attendant looking through the window spotted fire and smoke. Immediately, he picked up the intercom and took it upon himself to make an evacuation order. This quick thinking would go on to save many lives. In the end, the crash claimed the lives of 3 of the 291 passengers. 40 passengers were seriously injured, including 8 of the 12 flight attendants and 1 of the 4 flight crew members. But how had things gone so badly wrong on board Flight 214? How could such an experienced crew make such basic errors? The US National Transportation Safety Board carried out an extensive investigation into the crash. In their final report, they established that the crew had relied too much on automation which they did not understand, that they had unintentionally disabled the plane's autothrottle during the approach, and that they had failed to commence a go-around when it was clear that the plane was outside the allowed airspeed and altitude tolerances. The report described the complexities of the autopilot and autothrottle systems which the pilots fell prey to were not adequately explained in either Boeing's manuals nor in Asiana's pilot training. The report noted that all of these failures were likely compounded by the effects of fatigue. The NTSB recommended that Boeing develop enhanced training on automation modes to prevent confusion about when certain modes are activated. It also recommended that Asiana Airlines emphasize in its pilot training the need to adhere to standard operating procedures regarding autopilot use and regarding the call-out of automation mode changes. The board also recommended that the airline have its pilots do more manual flying, both in training and in daily operations. These changes have had sweeping implications for the aviation industry more generally, especially given the increasing reliance on automation by airlines around the world. The 777 remains an incredibly safe aircraft, but as always, the main challenges for safety are posed by the extent to which manufacturers, airlines and pilots are able to balance improvements in technology with the new training requirements that these changes necessitate.